I'm going to be speaking, well, also about metaphysics, and there is a lot of similarities, in what I'm going to be talking about with what Jeff has said now, right? So my initial topic was metaphysics and conceptual engineering, unlikely bedfellows, but I have, well, reconceived it a little bit. And now it's called dogmatic versus transcendental metaphysics and conceptual engineering. So the initial motivation, well, behind my talk is, well, I'm fascinated with the question what we can do when we do philosophy, right? So, and further on, it's about philosophical attempts, conceptual attempts to change the world via change of concepts and metaphysical concepts in particular, right? And prima facie, what gives us the reason to talk about that at all is when we're looking at history of philosophy, of how, say, Plato's or Aristotle's conceptions have shaped the world, and they continue shaping it, like right until today. So this is, well, the initial question, but well, I'm afraid that my paper contains little to no answers. It's rather like, first approximation and like, problematization of the field, but I hope that it's not going to be completely, well, useless. Okay, so yeah, in my talk, I'm going to be trying to show why we should bring together such separate fields as metaphysics, an old and venerated and yet controversial tradition, and a relatively new field of conceptual engineering that only recently gained some explicit attention among analytic philosophers. Obviously, this what now they call conceptual engineering is basically study of how we change concepts. It's become a separate discipline only recently, but this process has been ongoing, like, ever since, I don't know, the dawn of humanity, or like emergence of philosophy at least. Okay, so conceptual engineering is a domain that aspires to inquire the process and try to shed light on the mechanisms and intricate normativity in our dealings with concepts. At the first glance, these two areas, metaphysics and conceptual engineering, seem to be radically opposed, for it's commonly believed that metaphysics is about reality and robust, mind-independent being, the way the world is. And this picture is generally based on the presupposition that the subjective element should be excluded from the picture as an obstacle because, well, it brings in this kind of, well, subjective aberration, right? It hinders our attempts to know the way the world is. Yet, part of my argument is that that realistic metaphysical view is deficient or rather incomplete for two reasons. So first of all, such metaphysics basically leaves out of examination a significant part of what intrinsically belongs to being. So that is creatures endowed with reason and mind. And thus contemporary, well, general metaphysics, realist metaphysics, leaves out of examination the realm of conscious processes, the realm of normative, and the realm of values at the object level. Moreover, or like secondly, metaphysics is itself a sort of theory that is carried out by reasonable creatures. And the theory contains intrinsic norms and values and pragmatics that guide metaphysical enterprise. And if we are to have a full metaphysics, so it needs to be augmented and includes this account of those two things, basically object level human beings, or like human beings or reasonable beings considered at the object level, and then at the meta level, like from the point of view of pragmatics and normative part. Well, yeah, we can call it metaphysics, although like in contemporary analytic philosophy, yeah, it's not quite. So this label doesn't quite match like what analytic philosophers are talking about. So Obviously, this shift of our attention has been proposed by Kant and like then carried out later by Hegel, and they are like my main inspirational figures in this endeavor. So such metaphysics, like the renewed concept of metaphysics, can not only present accounts for explanation of physics and logic, etc., like regional domains or like domains of discourse, but also has got to serve its proper goal of orientation in the world, which includes the proposal of account of who we are, of ourselves, right? And metaphysics needs to account, after all, for beings with so endowed with reason and their practices with an explicit understanding of the pragmatic activity in our theory building. Yes, so obviously this is the general picture of how I'm trying to bring together, well, metaphysics inspired by German idealism with conceptual engineering and incorporate it into contemporary metaphysics. Okay, so traditional metaphysics is supposed to be a representation of the world as it is, like mind independent, and conceptual engineering as a systematic study of concepts from the angle of our capacity to affect them, to change them. It relies on concepts, and thus it permeates all philosophy, a study of various concepts and categories, and it reaches way beyond philosophy, of course. So, yet another point that I want to make or allude to at least is that these approaches, especially in metaphysics, were more concentrated on explication and clarification of what we already know, like basically by means or by some tools of that fall into the domain of conceptual engineering. However, with conceptual engineering, we can more actively explore the possible reach. Like when we engineer our metaphysical concepts, we actively or proactively create them and not only explicate what we have already known, like implicitly. So, and overall, that should advocate for exploration of our conceptual abilities that could initiate a change in our practice on theoretical level and also on the practical, basically in our understanding of the world via theory, including physics and other sciences, and our understanding of our social relations. But this is like very wide-reaching, and I'm not going to be able to cover like account in detail for all of this. But yeah, as I said, it's more or less a first approximation. Okay, so metaphysics is a broad discipline, and the term is used in a variety of ways. On the one hand, we generally call metaphysics a domain studying most fundamental and general features of the world. And this study is usually confined to several categories that are pivotal and presupposed in other domains, like thing and property, causality, and different modalities, and such like. So it concentrates on what there is and tries to account for different modes of being as they studied in different sciences and domains. On the other hand, it is quite common to see philosophical research titled by the pattern of metaphysics of X, be it aesthetics or like anything else. So any category or concept we can think of usually are included into the canon of metaphysics in a, well, such indirect way. So it's tacitly presuppose that we need to reach a state of a system, like, in our metaphysical enterprise. And those two facts account for the thesis that metaphysics has got a fundamental character and broadest possible scope. Okay, despite the fact that contemporary metaphysics accommodates all sorts and flavors of positions and theories ranging from hardcore physicalism to hardcore idealism, the physicalist or naturalist accounts do prevail, and the discipline of metaphysics can be loosely called metaphysics of object, realist metaphysics. Metaphysical realism, well, if we put it very crudely, holds that reality is mind independent, and usually it's claimed to be of physical or of physical nature, so that what metaphysics studies is the subject of physics, right? And so metaphysics is conceived of as something that is above physics and kind of studies well, our best scientific theories. So that means that regardless of our concepts and theories, there is a set of all things outside of us, and accordingly, there is a set of all truth that is independent of our grasp. And the goal of metaphysics and broader philosophy, although I generally use these terms interchangeably, so is to know all the truth and to find out, well, basically to build the ultimate theory that describes the ultimate of reality. And Hilary Putnam, who held this position early on in his career, expressed it neatly under the formula that for the whole world there is only one complete set of true descriptions, true propositions, and there could be only one correct metaphysics which we should attain, right, to properly describe the world. So there can be only one true metaphysical theory. Of course, like in contemporary research within analytic philosophy, there are countless variations and positions within these confines of realism alone. But this is of no use for our context now. So this sort of theory has got a lot of followers until today, like within and outside of philosophy, right? And well, we can out of top of my head. So like we can name Michael David, to some extent Christopher Peacock, and previously it was Quine and Armstrong and the Australian materialism movement, and so on and so on. It's an interesting fact, though, that these theories define reality, but what science, a theory, defines as real, right? And paradigmatically, of course, physics. So they tacitly import some sort of non-physical entity, such as a theory, right? So into their concept and account and defy reality by means of a non-physicalist entity. So it immediately points out to this tension, like, on different levels. Okay, so important feature is that these theories are insistently opposed to inclusion of thinking agents, and so they consider thinking agents and beings as an aberration or idealistic element within metaphysics, and they want to, like, banish it from there. So, and like in more recent form, it goes against linguistic or conceptual approaches such as presented by Michael Dummett or Donald Davidson, and so on. So this realistic understanding goes back to Aristotle, and yeah, it's pretty much commonly shared. Yes, and in this respect, contemporary metaphysics more or less continues the classical pre-Kantian metaphysics, only enhanced by, well, powerful logical tools. If we address the idealist spectra of metaphysical scale, so like in its pre-Kantian shape, basically we also have the same picture, because it generally claims that reality is a sort of, well, mental nature, maybe like, the content of divine mind and so on, but still we are in the same position, because this reality, although it's sharing something like, with our minds, is still considered to be independent from us and from our active intervention, right? So that we just need to attune our minds to basically recognize the world as it is. So these two pictures of idealist and realist metaphysics we can loosely call dogmatic metaphysics, basically following Kantian footsteps. So both of two accounts, or like, this unified account of dogmatic metaphysics, so face all sorts of epistemological problems, like, the problem of the access, and they bring skepticism to life. So realist account also has problems accounting for existence of normative dimension and accommodating values and thinking beings into the picture. So basically, what we can crudely call metaphysics of object loses subject, so thinking beings are lost in the picture. Idealistic metaphysics basically does the opposite and loses the world, the material world, because if everything is conceived of as mental, so there is no space left for, something non-mental, right? Okay, so this traditional conception of the metaphysics or dogmatic metaphysics has been criticized pretty heavily, and obviously we all know the names of the critics, like we can remember Hume, Kant, also later Wittgenstein and Carnap, and also Nietzsche and Heidegger. So one of them declared that metaphysics meaningless, so the other declared it being nihilistic and misleading. So, and at this point, Kant enters the stage. So his critique of metaphysics, that's also quite often misconceived, was rather not an attempt to eliminate metaphysics at all. It was an attempt to rescue it, to reform it. So the Kantian project of critique was of immense significance because on the one hand, it shows limitations of the classical dogmatic metaphysics, and also, on the other hand, it initiates transcendental turn, showing how the world is connected to us and to our cognition. So Kant's reform of metaphysics proceeded by importing thinking subject and its activity into the fabric of metaphysics and the world, so both on object level and matter level. So that still he understands metaphysics as study of ultimate structure of objects and also accounts for our account of metaphysics. So like he called it, like, in one place in his notes or letters, metaphysics of metaphysics. So like, and we can adopt this name and like compose metaphysics, the title of metaphysics. So it's like one side note. So it's often also overlooked that he did not forbid dogmatic method in metaphysics. It was allowed after the critique had cleared the way for it. So the metaphysics of object is valid, and the studies that are conducted now they have the great value. It's just that it should be augmented. It should be added with the transcendental account, with well, what we can call metaphysics of subject. So the crucial moment for Kant and also Hegel was the spontaneous activity of thinking beings, yeah, so a spontaneous activity of thinking exercised by subject. So it's expressed in form of active act of judgment as well, synthesizing activity. So the content, according to Kant, is synthesized by the transcendental unity of apperception, yeah, the way he called it. So, however, I don't want to go to discussing Kant in detail. So the point is here that the realm of the conceptual is the point where subject meets object, right? So, and metaphysics is not study of the world per se. So like metaphysicians don't go out and don't, I don't know, like test, I don't know, the particles of subatomic character and so on. So metaphysics, once again, is a study of concept of special sort, of categories. And those categories reveal the ways the world is. So I take the Kantian reading of concepts as rules that govern processes and our access to the world. So they are abstract entities through which we can interact with the world. And the rules, for instance, single out objects and domains of objects. We are concepts, we can talk about properties and so on. So concepts have got intentional and extensional dimensions, right? So like modes of grasping, or like as Frege called, if I'm not mistaken, Darstellungsweise or Vorstellungsweise. So basically the way we approach things and the way we talk about things. And also concepts have got what Christopher Peacock called semantic value. So it's basically reference. So we talk about actual objects by means of concepts. And so here for further detail, I refer to the works of aforementioned Christopher Peacock and, well, obviously, Pirmin Steckler-Weithofer, right, on concepts and metaphysics of concepts. So it's an important feature that concepts are tied into a holistic system or nexus, with some concepts being more central, than the others. So we can loosely say that those concepts belong to the domain of metaphysics. And there is an immediate objection, raised by Quine, who notably argued against so-called analytic truth. So, like, against his objection, I can say that those central concepts are not immutable to a change. So they're not immutable, and they are not completely separated from experience, right? So Quine's critique doesn't hold here on this account. Okay, so once again, the realistic account, the realistic metaphysics, is wrong. Like because it fails. Well, it's one-sided rather, like, it's incomplete because it fails to account for existence of thinking beings, and does it on object level and meta level. So because basically cannot grasp, like, pragmatic activity carried out by thinking being. The world is structured in a manner that the objects within the world can be identified, individualized, described, and so on. So basically, the world is structured the way that it's open for our conceptual grasp. So concepts are not purely mental, so they are mentally accessible, but by themselves they are well, abstract entities, and they are accessible intersubjectively, or well, Firmin would say, I think, that concepts have this transsubjective character. So concepts, and well, I'm talking mostly about philosophical concepts. So they reflect the structure of the world, and it shouldn't apply, although it's a possibility, that the world is made of thought, or like, mental matter, if we can say something like that, or that the whole world is contained in a divine mind. Like, it lately came to my attention that there are recent attempts to actually argue for that. Like, so there is this philosopher, I think his first name is Bernard, but so his last name is Castro. So I think that he works in the Netherlands. And so he's been defending this position lately, that everything is contained within a divine mind. So we need not presuppose the mental nature of the world. Nevertheless, so the world shares similar structure with the concepts, and also like Thomas Hofweber, yet another analytic philosopher, defends thesis with the name of harmony of reality in the world. So that reality is structured the way that we can conceptually grasp it, present in propositions, take attitudes to it, and so on. He also calls it holistic idealism, and he claims the centrality of mind to the world in this respect. Two more, or like one more account, one more conception should be mentioned in here, because similar view has been elaborated in semantic and epistemological angles by Professor Emeritus from Heidelberg, Anton Friedrich Koch. In one of his papers, he claims that the world needs thinking beings, because without them, without us, any world would lack in determinacy, because only thinking beings can supply the world with demonstrative and indexical. So there needs to be someone who can say here and there and now and so on. Without that, so basically the world is not completed, because objects themselves cannot take a determinate position by themselves. Well, it's very schematic presentation of his argument, and maybe definitely I'm missing some points, but still I think that should be accurate. So the significance of German idealism, specifically Kant and Hegel, in that respect is central, as they proposed improvements on the traditional metaphysics and included thinking beings into the fabric of the world, and underscored our contribution to theory building. Kant defined metaphysics not through its subject matter, as it used to be before, although it goes also, like, earlier than Kant, so like to the scholars. So Kant defined it not through first causes or being as such and so on, but he defined metaphysics as a certain type of cognition, certain type of knowledge that is gained by means of pure concepts, which means empirically unaided. So Hegel later on developed this approach within his science of logic. So, and he defined it as study of concepts that constitute, well, the way the world is and our knowledge. Recently, Adrian Moore, in his book on modern metaphysics, defined it as like basically systematic attempt of making sense of the world. Okay, yet again, or once again, so traditionally, prima philosophia was considered to be a passive reception of divine wisdom, kind of beamed out of like divinity or divine creature upon us, so that our task was to remove humanly originated obstacles, like, sensual distractions and so on, on the way that this divine knowledge could reach us, like, coming down us. So German idealism reverses the picture. This is an active process of us knowing the world through concepts. And yeah, so like if we retract our contribution, basically, yeah, we've got no metaphysical theory at all, because yeah, there is no theory, there is no knowledge without a thinking being, thinking subject. Okay, so regardless, yeah, of idealism or physicalism, so the dogmatic traditional dogmatic metaphysics sees the world as ready-made, right? And so it's ready-made for us receivers who should be ready to receive it. However, in one sense, we participate in creation of the world in our metaphysical theories. So it depends, like also, like, we should be very careful talking about that, but still in a way it depends on our conceptual activity and on conceptual choices that we make. And so those choices basically determine what we see and don't see in the world. In this respect, metaphysical concepts have a fundamental guiding role for the entirety of conceptual nexus in our knowledge. The traditional reading of metaphysics in our language mostly comes down to explanatory function of already pre-existing practices and categories, structure of the world, and so on, aiming at dispelling fallacies and establishing consistency among the in our concept use and among the domains and so on. Basically, it's disambiguation, elimination of fallacies, and so on. In doing so, yes, it mostly focuses on what there already is, be it physicalism, materialism, idealism. There is no problem with that per se, but this reading is incomplete because it ignores the relevance of our proactive work on the concepts. And first and foremost, I want to stress our conceptual innovation, our conceptual formation in metaphysics of what can be done or achieved by conceptual activity, by creating new concepts. So since metaphysics as a theory is itself a conceptual activity, doesn't only explicate our concepts and clarify our theories or language use in general, but it also exhibits the capacity for changing or forming concepts. Yes, and in this respect, conceptual metaphysics is our way to talk about that, right? If concepts are rules that govern or describe processes, and we can govern concepts in various ways. So in a way, we can adjust our concepts and initiate some change in our theory that might be reflected in the world, like in the way we perceive the outside world or also the social world. So the account of metaphysics I want to argue for is basically the one that equates or equals to conceptual engineering on fundamental metaphysical level, and in a way, it coincides with philosophy. So it follows Kantian and Hegelian footsteps by importing the subjects and practical practices of reasonable creatures into the fabric of the world, bringing attention to metaphysics as a theory and its pragmatic component. And yeah, so once again, this productive aspect of metaphysics. So like when we create new metaphysical theory or new metaphysical conception, we create a new way of interaction with the world, right? And so this novelty should be well accounted for, like, yeah, and obviously I cannot do it in such a short talk. So there is an objection actually, so that I got recently from colleagues, and they say that basically what I'm talking about is dealt with in other disciplines, like outside of metaphysical enterprise, in domains like ethics or philosophy of consciousness, social sciences, and so on and so on. But here again, I want to stress the need for incorporation of metaphysics of object and metaphysics of subject. Basically, we need to have, well, at least a vague picture that would combine them, so that our metaphysics influences the way we conceive of the world and ourselves, and it in a way defines or determines our practices, and our practices in their turn reflect or influence the metaphysical theories that we have. So the question arises, right? Can we actually affect the world via conceptual change? So basically, yeah, so it's recently been called as the externalist challenge, right? So like the world resists our conceptual interventions. So like, yeah, the world as a subject matter of metaphysics in a certain aspect is open for a variety of readings, basically what Jeff has been talking about, like, and it's not, so yeah, it's the thesis of underdetermination. Yeah, so like there is no way we can describe the world completely in just one theory, right? So in different metaphysical theories, different interpretations provide us with different results in different aspects of reality are highlighted in these theories. So in some sense, the world depends on us. However, it's not that we construct the world fully as well, some hardcore constructivists would claim. So one may want to conceptualize this conceptual truth in terms of paradigms or frameworks or, well, else. So conceptual activity of reasonable thinking, acting, and speaking agents is based upon fundamental conceptual choices that define our paradigms and frameworks. Those choices are subject to our deliberation and purposeful change. Well, at least it looks this way, prima facie. And so metaphysics is governing and fundamental discipline, and it's involved actively or passively into the process of changing our world. So yeah, and I'm coming to an end of my talk now. So these choices have a history. Yeah, and basically history of philosophy is a history of those conceptual choices and drawing consequences from them, right? And we are like in our position here and now, not exempt from it. So our conceptual interventions are responses to theoretical or practical difficulties we face. And notably, Hegel coined the term determined negation for, well, explanation of this. So exercise of conceptual engineering is a token of our collective freedom over ourselves and our history. So we are not free to do whatever we want, but still we are granted, if we may say so, a certain amount of freedom. And if metaphysics is a fundamental theory of reality, so we need to be able to explicate our conceptual choices and readjust them, like actively. So the overall point is to take control over ourselves via transparency and control over our conceptual practices. And obviously, this implies like lots and lots of questions concerning normativity, fact-value dichotomy, and so on. And yeah, concluding this talk, I want to point to two challenges like that at the moment seem to me to be well, the most interesting and fundamental. So first of all, I've already mentioned this is the externalist challenge. Basically, objects or world resist our attempts of conceptual change, and they kind of can be very persistent in, well, putting constraints on our wish to, well, readjust concepts, right? So the question arises, can we actually initiate any change? To what extent and how deep can we go, right? Well, this is one cluster of problems. And another one, actually, since we have lots of Heidegger experts in here, so another question I want to raise is basically, can we start anew this way, right? So like I'm referring here to two different approaches of trying to start anew. Basically, this is the Marx theory trying to practically invert or like, change the world. And on the other hand, Heidegger with his metaphysical conceptual attempt to basically sparkle the new beginning. Yes, and on that note, I'd like to conclude my talk. Yeah, thank you for your attention. Yes, okay. So yeah, you could ask questions, or even better, like we can like discuss.
Question, Dennis?
Yeah.
So two issues I want to raise. Firstly, you know, the indeterminacy problem can also be put in terms of an incompleteness problem, right, which you sort of alluded to. And we can model incompleteness, if you like, in formal terms on Tarski, the need to move to a meta level, or we can do it in terms of Gödel or whatever. Arguably, there's an incompleteness that I would say attaches to the world, in that there can be no complete account of the world. And I would argue, however, that incompleteness also applies to our concepts. Right. So there is no possibility of engaging with and, let's say, reforming or changing our concepts as a totality. That means there's always something that we are incapable of addressing. And that suggests that there's a fundamental obscurity to it, and a problematic obscurity in any attempt at a certain form of conceptual engineering. So let me just say a little bit about conceptual engineering, because as I understand it, there are two senses involved in conceptual engineering, because there's a sense of conceptual engineering that applies outside of philosophy as well as within, according to which it's an attempt to, as it were, reform and change our concepts according to what we would like those concepts to be doing. Now, I think that that's problematic, given the incompleteness, because it means that we cannot make the concepts themselves completely transparent. There will always be the potential of a residue within the concept that might distort, change, or mean that the concept resists our attempt to reform it. Okay? So I'm wondering how you respond to that problem, because it seems to me that that might be an insoluble problem. The second question I want to put is that I'm wondering, and this might have just been an artifact of my incomplete understanding of your paper, and that is, it seems to me you were working with two notions of conceptual engineering or of conceptual engagement. Because in the history of philosophy in one sense has always involved conceptual analysis, right? Strawson talks about conceptual analysis as being what he's doing in a book like Individuals. And in one sense, all philosophy is about, and always has been, a certain form of conceptual analysis or conceptual articulation. And sometimes that's involved in formulating new concepts where we don't have a concept already, or modify. And this happens everywhere. It's just part of what we do when we do science, for instance, right? I mean, one example is the example of the concept of a planet, which could have been defined in terms of an extension, but it also has an implicit intentional component that means that Pluto is no longer regarded as a planet, and so our concept of planet has subtly changed to some extent as a result of choice. But I'm wondering if we can distinguish between two components within conceptual engineering, if we call it that. One is what I want to call stipulative conceptual engagement, and the other articulative or explicative. And the stipulative is the case where we decide what the concept will mean. The other is the case where we're constantly involved in trying to, as it were, work out what's involved in the concepts we use. Both of them will be subject to incompleteness, because both of them will mean that there's always a residue we can never fully fill out. That won't be a problem for the explicative or articulative mode of analysis, so long as it doesn't claim completeness, but it will be a problem for a stipulative mode of analysis, because the extent to which we can stipulate the intention or possibly the extension of a concept will always be severely limited. And so I'm wondering, do you want to restrict your account to explicative, what I'm calling explicative or articulative analysis, which is much more in keeping with what philosophical conceptual analysis has been? Or do you want to also include this notion of stipulative analysis? And then, as I say, I think this problem of incompleteness, of there being always an obscure residue remaining within the concept, even when we seek to define it, that's going to be a problem, it seems to me. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me start from the second one then. Yeah, so definitely. Well, I would distinguish at least for operation, like, concerning concepts, like, so as to the change, so we can either alterate or reinterpret already given concepts, or we can try to preserve them, right? So like keeping them intact. So, or else we can introduce a new concept or eliminate like previous one, like, that's been existing. So yes, philosophy has been doing explicative work all along, right? But it could be done in various ways. Like, we can just, so previously we might have had like, one concept and then we do the disambiguation, then we get two concepts, like, that are tools more accurate, like, for their like tasks, right? And so we can be talking, I don't know, like, uh, yeah, so like, what would be an example of that? Or like, well, it's more or less clear. Another example could be like, this famous thing with changing our concept of mammals, right? So previously we thought that like, whatever resides in the ocean is fish, like, in this or that sort. And then we came to know that certain sort of, well, swimming creatures are mammals, like, like dolphins and whales and so on. And so we have readjusted our concept so that we now, like, use it more accurately, right? So like basically we change the rules, the way, uh, and so the way we handle the world also changed, right? And it has got pragmatic value. So the question, so this is why, well, like, those were like, instances of articulative or explicative. So and what you call stipulative, basically I consider pretty much, yeah, all history of philosophy, like, trying to come up with new concepts that would well, help us reimagine the world we live in. Like, all of Heidegger, basically all he does, like at any page almost, like, he tries to well, give us a new concept, like, to make us think differently, like, to give a different angle, like, and well, we can call it in very different, we can call it like with different names, but yeah, this is what he tried to do. If it worked or not, it's a different question, right? And so the well, the thrust of my talk was exactly that we should perhaps do more of stipulative work, right, to explore new possible aspects of the world. And I even might go so far to claim that if philosophy could be experimental, this is a way that we can, like, take our experiments, like, so we devise a new concept, then we try to implement it and see what happens, like, draw the consequences. We can try to do it speculatively, like, before going to the world and, trying to, well, impose or somehow make people use our concept. But if we do that, so we might see, like, what the concept um, implicates, like, what's like practical consequences there are, and so on. And well, in completeness, like, going to the first question also, yes, definitely. So we can arguably never change the state of completeness because, well, it's a process, right? And a process is completed when it's finished, right? So perhaps, like, when humanity dies out, a sort of completeness could be achieved, but not by us, but by like some possible other thinking beings, like if there are any at all, right? In this respect, we can perhaps speak about well, some kind of relative completeness or relative totality. So our conceptual nexus presents, in a way, a totality that doesn't aspire, well, maybe it aspires to be like, the absolute totality, like, in regular meaning of the word, but it does not, well, encompass all that there could be. It's just like, we're trying to work with what we have and readjust so that, like, our conceptual apparatus could do a slightly better job than, well, it did before, right? And this completeness, well, it's an ideal that we're trying to reach, but I think that, well, it's clear more or less, well, it's a topic of another conversation that it's we cannot possibly hope to actually reach it. So like we should be content with like this kind of relative completeness, so that, like, we avoid or like eradicate some kind of obvious contradictions or like inconsistencies, and then like we readjust our conceptual nexus so that the contradictions that we stumbled upon are dealt with, and yet another yet other contradictions are coming, and so like we could just try to figure it out when it arises. So I hope that it was I pointed out to the strategy of dealing with that, and I hope that I could address your questions at least a bit.
Can I just ask a follow-up? What would be an example for you of a genuinely new concept in Heidegger? A concept that is indeed new to Heidegger that has no precedent.
Well, Dasein, for instance, it kind of springs to mind, obviously, because, he wants to draw a clear distinction from subject, traditional modern subject. And so he introduces this concept not as a matter. So basically, he breaks down with the previous tradition of usage of the word, something like dietitious da or something like that. Basically, just an indexical pointing out to an object. So in front of me, in front of us, right? And so Dasein is one example of it. And so you've mentioned this paper, Bowen, Won, and Denkin. And this is another one. So he takes the words that we know, but he gives them new meaning, and which means that he tries to give a new conceptual content. So he's trying to build a new rule for us to think about something. It is quite new, but I wouldn't say that he took it out of nowhere. So it's a big question if we can start something completely new. And to my mind, he was clearly trying to do something kind of to jump out of our history and land some new beginning to avoid the mistakes of the calculative thinking and so on.
We might talk more about that at some point, but
I feel that you're skeptical. So perhaps we could just discuss that a bit later, in via emails. And as I said, it's work in progress. So many possibilities that I didn't have the time to address. Hope it was at least a bit convincing.
Thank you.
I think, can you hear me?
Yeah. Ingo, please.
I think Heidegger would have called it conceptual technology, or maybe word technology, or maybe thought technology, and he would not have been a favorite. It would not have been his favorite enterprise in philosophy. I think the distinction that Jeff just drew up between stipulative and explicative uses of concept engineering is very important, because there is obviously the idea, if you go with this constructivist mode, that if we give people the right concepts, then they will have the right view on the world, and that will be all the much the better. Now, what you're missing in your account is, first of all, an account of truth. Concepts are not truths. It's as simple as that. Has never been. And so you're actually working with an unanalyzed concept of concept, and you're leaving out the notion of truth. If you're thinking that concepts are basically can change according to psychological dispositions, that we want to have this or that, then you're not very far away from Orwell. In fact, it is Orwell. So it is straightforward. Out of Orwell, that's where it comes from. And the philosophical confusion, in my view, is that there is a difference between transcendental concepts and psychological engineering of empirical concepts. And that's what you are doing. And so there is no way that Immanuel Kant ever was a constructivist, in the sense that he said, oh, wouldn't it be a fine idea if space was, you know, such and such a form of consciousness. He claims that it is a necessary condition for the possibility of even thinking that I'm placing things in space and time. That's a very different analysis from saying, oh, wouldn't it be cool if such and such a thing was the case? So that you have to work out, first of all, a concept of truth, and secondly, a difference between transcendental concepts and psychologically manufactured concepts, or empirical concepts. Empirical concepts, you can have, you know, all sorts of differences there, but they actually are philosophically uninteresting. They're philosophically, for the description of the world, uninteresting. Just one last comment. I do not believe that Heidegger, well, first of all, on the concept of Dasein, interestingly enough, Heidegger didn't invent it, because actually it happens to be a word, but if you want to have someone who invented it, it would have been Rilke, who was a poet. So there is, you know, a little bit more to be said about that. But the point, of course, is that Heidegger offers it as a description of who we are, not as, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you were Dasein? He says, that's what you are, and I'm giving you an account based on Dasein in relation to being, and so on and so forth. And that is actually couched in terms of, you know, an ultimate claim to truth. So I need to know more about, you know, where truth stands in your account, the difference between psychological manufacturing of or empirical concepts and transcendental concepts.
Yeah, so let me start my reply from your last point. So yeah, so Heidegger may have not invented the word or the concept, but he suggested a huge conceptualization. Basically, yeah, he wrote a whole treatise on what Dasein is and how it functions in different respects, which really clearly did not do, or like, you know, didn't want to do, like in the first place. Yeah, and the word, yeah, it's a part of a common German vocabulary, yeah, and it's used on daily basis. So I was talking about, well, its philosophical use. Well, it appears in Hegel's Science of Logic, and well, maybe in other texts. Kant uses it, like, you know, now and again, but it's about, like, you know, basically just about factual being, like, you know, states of affairs, like, you know, that I can see a chair in front of me, and so this chair is a Dasein to me, right? Because it stands here, right? So yes, so about concept of truth, yes, definitely. So like on the regular reading, concepts well cannot be assessed on the like in terms of truth or falsity. But concepts do appear in judgments, and judgments are the minimal bearers of truth value, right? And so, like, concepts play a pivotal role in how well this kind of object level truth functions, right? Yes, obviously, I didn't have yeah the time or space, like, you know, to cover this point, so it was more presupposed. So, like, basically, there is no judgment without a concept, right? And so judgments, well, operate with concepts, and, like, you know, our propositional attitudes, well, put us into relation to judgments, and, like, you know, we may assess concept as being highly functional, like, you know, that does its job, or it does its job in a deficient way, or, like, you know, that it's a concept of, like, you know, no use, or it's a bad concept, like, you know, well, and this kind of conceptual illumination has been also always the case, that, like, we choose to not use, like, you know, a concept, or, like, you know, certain conceptions, because we assess, like, you know, the consequences of this use are very fallacious, and, like, you know, possibly harming, and so on.
Again, I find that, you know, an intriguing prospect for philosophy if we become concept technicians. I'm pretty sure that our politicians will be in the philosophy departments right away to make sure that we get the right concepts for the proper political responses. And so my response is that I do know there is a lot of discussion about phenomenology, there is the view that, perception and intuition is what ultimately bases truth. What is given in intuition, not in a concept, but in intuition. And that is perception. Now, you would have to argue there is no such thing, or it is always, overlaid by concepts. But, from a phenomenological perspective, you would say there is something over against which I stand. I can give you a description of it in such a way that, people can, and we can take, the Davidson triangulation method or whatever you want. And that is where you need to have a truth. It's not a matter of, having, one set of glasses on and then another set of glasses and I see something else. There is something there, and that is given to you in intuition. That's at least the phenomenological account.
Yes, but also, like, what Jeff has been talking about, like, events or things allow for various modes of description, for various interpretative frameworks, right? And well, I want to suggest an angle which says that, like, we can actively devise interpretative tools, or, like, the whole nexuses, right? And well, concepts may not be truth bearers, right? So they are not, of course. Well, at least in the traditional reading, and, like, actually, in a way, Plato and Hegel suggested this kind of non-traditional reading of concepts as being true, being the truth bearers. But, like, I don't want to go here in detail, right? So, but concepts, we may evaluate concepts on their, like, fitness or unfitness, like, so they have intrinsic normativity to their use. It might not be called truth, but it has got, like, yeah, values. So, like, we may assess them and try to change them and so on. And as to well, you very correctly raise the question of manipulation and this kind of technology of concepts. This is true. So, like, there should be some conceptual ethics to that. So, like, well, we need to think about, like, possible limitations for our conceptual interventions and so on. But, like, if we take a look at history of philosophy, like, and, like, Plato comes into mind, like, the first thing. So what he tried to do, basically, his whole metaphysics is an attempt to redefine the life of the ancient polis. Like, the death of Socrates was like, a starting point for that. And, like, it's Ernst Tugendhat who claimed in his later book, like, anthropology instead of metaphysics, right? So the whole Platonic metaphysics was basically an ethical theory. He was looking for a recipe to build a perfect society within one city, right? And further on, I don't know, like, basically, intention or deliberately or not, like, when philosophers do propose new theories, they shape the world. And, well, the idea is, like, what if we try to do it, like, deliberately, like, actively, although with all sorts of limitations and preoccupations and reservations, definitely.
Yes, you're exactly right. Tugendhat would be supporting your view because he thinks that there is no such thing as philosophy. Okay, that book that you just quoted says all philosophy is just anthropology, and it is just, a more or less, well, I guess he would say that there is, a lot of thought in anthropology, but basically he basically dismisses the idea that there is philosophy as an independent intellectual endeavor. It is just an expression of anthropology. Now, that, for someone who studied under Heidegger, that's something.
Yeah. Well, I broaden his conception of philosophy in this respect, and I do consider it to be philosophy also, not just anthropology. Yes,
Yeah.
but yeah,
but that's what he says. Yeah, at least that's how I read him.
Only a short remark, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Ingo, I think that your point is something we should never forget because it's absolutely important. But nevertheless, there is, of course, a great tradition in the 20th century. It's not only Russell, it's also Paul Lorenzen and many others who thought that, even Tugendhat, who thought that what conceptual engineering in the sense of making our concept correct and exact and easy to handle with is the task of philosophy. Of course, this is a new definition in a certain sense of philosophy. And your point is that is a naive and a little bit dangerous way of thinking what philosophy could be in your comparison to Orwell. I think we have to keep that in mind, but I think that Denis has still another point. And the point of Denis is when we develop the language of reflection on all these things, we shouldn't assume that we just continue the already schematized way of using language. And on this level, there is innovation, and both Jeff and Ingo proposed do not use the word conceptual engineering for that, because that has this ring of making things independently of what people know and the reality and so on and so on. We could agree with that, but on the other hand, we should keep in mind these differences.
No.
Yeah. Sorry, Ingo, you have to respond.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valuable point. But if we go to concept engineering, for instance, Hume comes to mind, and we have a long discussion about causality. Or if you want, we're having a discussion about the self. But it is certainly not in the sense of, wouldn't we be better off if we had such and such a thing?
Exactly.
And that is, something where I would just caution that we do not go into concept engineering with that kind of idea in mind. That's all. That we have to refine our concepts. And by the way, when I said that I was, a little bit more, you heard right, or look, there is definitely a place for imagination also in philosophy. I don't have a problem with that, but it needs to be flagged as such. So I don't want to want to come across as you're realist in your talk, where there is a mind-independent reality. Actually, I'm much more on the Kantian side, where I think that transcendental concepts have a particular a function, and it is not that we can simply change them as we like. That's all that I wanted to say. And so the truth condition really is something that needs to be built into your account. That's all.
Yeah. Thank you. And just one short remark, and then I'll hand the word over to you, Ingo. So I've adopted this label conceptual engineering because it's now an established, well, we may call it industry. So there is this domain and dozens of authors write about that, and it's become a term of art, so to speak. It's just, well, yeah, it does ring so it does remind us of the connotation of manipulation, some sort of scamming or scheming. Yes, and I agree completely. Yes, and I also have my questions towards the label, right? It's just, yeah. So I wanted to to point out to this existing tradition. Yes, thank you all for your questions and remarks. And I would love to, continue that, discussion in email conversation or else. So if you have any thoughts to share, please
Dennis,
do.
Before we move on to Ingo, can I just make one small suggestion for you? It's a sort of technical suggestion. And that is, if you want to deal with the question that Ingo put to you about the relation between concepts and truth, one way to do that within the framework of what you're doing is to treat concepts as always having a role within judgments, which is what you alluded to. You would need to think about whether you say that concepts are always function in judgments as predicative terms or whatever. Concepts will then function in judgments, and the structure of the concept will be given by the judgments, the nature of the judgments in which those concepts can enter when those judgments are true. Okay, and so null concepts or empty concepts will be concepts that figure in no true judgments. Right? Now you'll have to, there's a little bit of finessing to be done there in terms of when does a concept legitimately figure in a judgment. But I think if you want to deal with the problem of truth, you do it through the role that concepts play in judgment. That needs a little bit of explication. And then the difference will be between concepts that figure in true judgments and judgments that figure only in judgments that are false. Concepts that figure only in judgments that are false will be empty concepts. Judgments that figure in at least some true judgments will be judgments that are contentful, and the content will be specified by the true judgments in which those concepts figure. So that gives you a formal way of connecting truth to judgment and using that in order to explicate the content of the concept. And my guess is if you went back to Peacock and people like that, you would find the resources to give a more detailed account of concepts of the sort that would help the sort of account you want to give. Sorry, I just thought it was that might be a useful technical point to help you in developing what you want to do a little bit further.
Yeah, thank you. But it's so much circular, and like, how do we assess truth value of metaphysical judgments?
Of course, that's another question, but at
That
least it
would be
does
like,
give you a mechanism.
Yeah. Thank you a lot. Yeah, so I'm afraid we've discussion of my talk has always tapped.
Yeah.
By
Sorry.
10 minutes. Yeah. Thank you.